Just before the release of Resident Evil Village in early 2021, Capcom made a major shift in their planned direction for the series. The plan for the RE franchise in the 2020s was initially to have those large-budget mainline releases every few years just like usual, and supplement those with a bunch of smaller-budget spin-off titles that would either be handled by smaller development teams within Capcom, or just be outsourced to other developers entirely, with the hope being that they would be able to achieve at least one release per year with these smaller projects in the mix, just like they did back in the early 2000s. But after the overwhelmingly negative fan reception to the Resident Evil 3 Remake and RE Resistance, executives at Capcom decided to move away from this strategy. Numerous projects that were already in production were cancelled, from a Resident Evil Revelations 3 to an open-world co-op shooter called Resident Evil Apocalypse, and even a spin-off with one of the most mysterious characters in the series called Resident Evil HUNK. And most interestingly of all, a remake of Resident Evil 4 that had originally been outsourced to a newer Japanese development studio called M2, who was largely made up of former devs from both Capcom and PlatinumGames. But in the wake of all this restructuring, Capcom decided to bring development of the RE4 Remake back in-house and put it in the hands of the same team who worked on the RE2 Remake. And so a couple years later, fans would be given the announcement of said Resident Evil 4 Remake. And it almost goes without saying, but expectations were ridiculously high for this one, as were concerns of them not being able to recapture what made the original so special, primarily due to the release of the Resident Evil 3 Remake only a couple years prior. So the stakes could not have been much higher for Capcom going into this one, and members of the team even acknowledged this in pre-release interviews, talking about how intimidating of a remake this was due to the fact that the original Resident Evil 4 was still widely considered one of the greatest games ever made. So, with the project shifting developers midway through and expectations ridiculously high, would they manage to stick the landing on this one? Well, let's talk about it. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by the good folks at Green Man Gaming, and right now, they've got a huge discount available for the highly anticipated Resident Evil Requiem. That's right, you can already save 18% on Resident Evil Requiem on PC at Green Man Gaming before it has even launched, and this is available across both the standard and deluxe editions of the game. All pre-orders also include the additional Apocalypse costume for Grace, so if you don't want to miss out, be sure to grab either version of the game at Green Man Gaming right now. The fun doesn't stop there either, as Green Man Gaming always has plenty of deals available on the latest and greatest PC games, so be sure to check out Green Man Gaming through the link below and save big on your next game when you shop with them. Thank you Green Man Gaming for supporting the channel, and now back to the video. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil 4 is a remake of, well, Resident Evil 4, developed and published by Capcom for the PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, and PC in 2023. Much like all of the other Resident Evil remakes up to this point, RE4's remake sticks very closely to the original story, making small adjustments here and there, but still hitting all of the major plot beats and memorable moments throughout the game. We still play as Leon Kennedy working for the US government roughly 6 years after the events of RE2, and are sent into a remote village in Spain to rescue the president's daughter from unknown kidnappers. And as is always the case in Resident Evil games, things still go to shit pretty much as soon as we arrive, and this mission quickly turns into a desperate fight for survival. I will say though, that the Resident Evil 4 remake has had one of the most drastic changes made to its story, in spite of still having all of the scenes and events that fans would remember from the original, as the overall tone of the story is significantly different here. The game has a much darker, more serious tone than the original did, with the iconic comedy of the original still being here, but being toned back a good bit to allow for the actual horror of the game to sit up front this time around, which I'm entirely here for. Like I mentioned in my review of the original, I always felt that RE4 should be a genuinely scary game, given the threat of a literal, body-snatching, mind-controlling parasite, but the lighthearted tone and the way that Leon just shrugged everything off and made a joke of it never really allowed that threat to feel as imposing as it should have. But here in the remake, the threat feels very real. Leon is still capable of cracking a joke or making a sarcastic comment without entirely undercutting the tone, and everything just feels much darker from the very moment you arrive in the village. This was the sort of tone that I had always wished the original RE4 had, so while I know that a lot of people were likely disappointed in how different things felt, I absolutely adore this tonal shift. It also helps that the voice acting in the Resident Evil franchise has come a very long way from the mid-2000s, with the franchise making use of some of the best voice talent in the entire industry nowadays. The acting is much better across the board here, with maybe one exception in Ada Wong, whose performance does feel pretty flat this time around. But in the interest of fairness, they also seem to have written her as being considerably colder and more disinterested here than she was in the original, so it's legitimately hard to tell if this was an intentional change or just a flat performance. The real standouts for me, though, were definitely Leon and Ashley, with Genevieve Buchner delivering an amazing performance for Ashley that brings a ton of new depth to her character, and Nick Apostolidis reprising his role as Leon after the RE2 remake, and somehow making him sound familiar, but entirely different from RE2 at the same time. I mean, seriously, when you put Nick's performances as Leon from RE2 and RE4 side by side, it's almost shocking that it's the same actor sometimes.
Whoa! God damn, you're a big boy. Holy shit!
And of course, as is the usual for the franchise, the RE4 Remake delivers some downright stunning visuals and art direction. Every area from the original has been reimagined with stunning detail, with even the island from the end of the game looking significantly more interesting than it did in the original. Granted, the island is still just a whole lot of gray factories and laboratories, but the new capabilities of the RE engine really do help to add a lot of extra contrast and visual intrigue that the original on the GameCube just obviously wasn't capable of. I really love the look of both the village and the castle here in the remake though, with both of these areas definitely being in the running for the best looking settings from the entire franchise, right alongside some of the more visually striking areas from RE Village. My only real complaint with the visuals is that there aren't really proper transitions between their color grading post-processing filters here, so sometimes you'll just be walking down a hallway or opening up a door, and suddenly your screen just pops with a strong green tint out of nowhere. Small complaint, I know, but I'm trying to find something here so that I'm not just glazing the game for the first 10 minutes of the video. Now that we've covered the presentation though, let's talk actual gameplay. If you're familiar with the original RE4, then you'll already be very familiar with the general formula of the remake, as it's remained the exact same. You'll still be exploring the environments of the village, the castle, or the island, walking into intense combat encounters throughout that will raise the tension significantly, before going back to slowly exploring and finding extra resources and treasure items to lower the tension between said encounters. Those treasure items can still be sold to the merchant for cash, and said cash is still used to either buy new weapons, or just upgrade the ones that you already like to make them even better. And I have to say, the level design, encounter design, and just general pacing of the game is as good as it's ever been. Admittedly being slightly downgraded in some areas, but also being slightly upgraded in just as many, if not more areas. I mean seriously, the infamous island portion from the original is actually fun now, and doesn't feel like an absolute slog to get through at the end of the game. And fans of the original will already know how significant of an improvement that actually is. So in a broad sense, this is still the same Resident Evil 4 that fans will know and love, but on a deeper level, there are a ton of small changes that make it feel entirely new at the same time. Let's start with what is arguably the most important part of any action horror RE game: the combat. As one might expect, Leon's controls and combat mechanics are significantly smoother here than they were in the original. We have more typical third-person shooter controls as opposed to the original's over-the-shoulder tank controls, complete with all of the little things that you would expect to come with them, like moving and shooting at the same time being a possibility now. They've also given Leon some very believable inertia and locomotion, which make him just slow enough for your spacing and positioning to be as crucial here in the remake as they were in the OG. Plus, moving while aiming is possible, but it is incredibly slow, so you'll still have to lower your weapon and run away in order to retreat or dodge attacks effectively. One of the most significant changes that's been made, though, is that the iconic laser sights from the original are now just gone here. At least, kind of. When you aim a weapon in the RE4 Remake, you get a more typical aiming reticle with the bullet going somewhere random within the range displayed on screen. Along with that, they've also added in that mechanic from the RE2 and 3 remakes, where if you stand still and aim for a few seconds, the reticle will close until it's nearly perfectly accurate, and firing a shot with your reticle closed like this will deal some extra bonus damage, as well as raise your chance of landing a critical shot, which I do think feels a bit out of place here considering the general pace of RE4's combat encounters. That being said though, it's perfectly fine to just ignore this mechanic entirely outside of the rare situations where you can comfortably sit still to get that bonus damage. So it doesn't really impact the gameplay, it just feels a bit odd to include here, and almost feels like it was included just because it could be, if that makes sense. What I do love about this change though, is the new dynamic that it brings to the weapon sandbox. See, with the accuracy of each weapon now being slightly different, it adds a whole new element to the balancing of the game where certain weapons can now either excel at quick and precise shooting or be characteristically inaccurate. Take, for example, the decades-long debate of the handguns of Resident Evil 4. The Red 9 and the Blacktail have always been a contested duo since they both sport very high damage compared to the other handguns, with the Red 9 having the highest damage per shot in class, and the Blacktail only having the second best damage per shot, but beating out the Red 9 in basically every other category. Many players still swear by the Red 9 being the best purely because of its damage per shot. But now in the remake, they've been able to make this debate even more interesting by giving the Red 9 the worst accuracy out of all the handguns, giving the Blacktail about average accuracy, and then giving the starting handgun and the Punisher the option to attach a classic laser sight for perfect accuracy. This one change alone makes choosing your preferred weapons even more interesting than it already was, which is saying quite a bit because RE4 easily had the most interesting weapon sandbox out of the entire franchise. And as if further refinement and fleshing out of the existing sandbox wasn't enough, they've also added some totally new weapons into the mix here. For example, a whole new rifle has been added to the remake, with the CQBR rifle from the RE3 Remake being included here. This adds a whole new layer to choosing your perfect rifle, as now you not only have a super high damage bolt-action rifle contrasted by a lower damage semi-automatic rifle, you now have an additional option in the form of an even lower damage but fully automatic rifle. So even though the damage per shot is by far the worst in class, it still has the rifle trait of dealing triple damage to weak spots, and the full auto capability gives it theoretically the highest damage per second out of any weapon in the entire game. That is, assuming that you have a big ammo stockpile for it, and you can actually aim well and control the recoil of it. So again, the remake just adds even more options and more interesting choices when it comes to your loadout compared to the original, which is a huge positive. Additionally, these weapons can now be swapped between in real time with shortcuts, much like in the other RE Engine titles, which is also a huge improvement. It keeps the combat pacing and tensions high, since you'll no longer be habitually pausing in the middle of difficult encounters to swap to the appropriate weapon. Instead, the pressure is just always on now, which, as a horror game fan, I love. Most interestingly, in my opinion though, the resources in this game, like ammo and healing items, are significantly more limited than they were in the original, which really helps RE4 ride that line between survival horror and action horror a lot better than it did before. You've still got all of the crazy, over-the-top action that you had before, but the lack of ammo and healing items makes it feel like you're constantly juggling between your weapons to make the most of every single bullet and carefully planning out how and when to use certain resources. It helps RE4's action feel a bit more in line with that classic survival horror gameplay, but without ruining what made RE4 so different from the classic entries in the first place. So again, this is a huge win in my book. And to complement this new approach, the mine thrower has also been replaced by the new bolt thrower, which is available pretty much right at the start of the game now, rather than only becoming available a little more than halfway through. This bolt thrower acts like a sort of mini crossbow, launching silent bolts at enemies that can be retrieved after that enemy has been killed, effectively turning it into an infinite ammo option in the right hands. Although it is certainly the slowest killing weapon in the entire sandbox. And for those who miss the mine thrower's functionality, you can actually get your hands on some explosive tips for the bolts that can then be attached with the press of a single button, resulting in a shot that behaves exactly like the original RE4's mine thrower, but at the cost of destroying the bolt in the explosion. And as if that wasn't interesting enough, we've also seen a significant overhaul to Leon's knife, which has now gone from the piece of equipment that arguably dulled the combat the most, to the single most interesting piece of equipment in the entire game. To start, using the knife will now burn through a durability bar, much like it did in the RE2 Remake, rather than just being infinite use like it was in the original RE4. More interestingly though, Capcom has also added a ton of new uses for the knife that never existed before. For example, some enemies will begin to mutate after being killed, which will see them getting back up in an even more powerful state if this mutation completes. But to prevent it, you can run over to them in the short time window provided and finish them off with your knife in an instant at the cost of a chunk of your remaining durability. The knife can also be used to block certain attacks from enemies, but again, this will cost you a chunk of your durability, so you don't want to rely on it too much. If timed perfectly though, you can get a full parry instead of a simple block, which will knock the enemy off balance and allow for a melee counterattack on top of just preventing yourself from taking damage. Not all attacks in the game can be blocked or parried, however, with things like grabs simply being unblockable and other attacks needing to be evaded instead, which keeps players on their toes and encourages them to still learn the enemy's attack patterns and react accordingly during combat, rather than just mindlessly mashing the block button every time they're in danger. So not only have they eliminated that dominant strategy from the original, where players would simply knock enemies to the ground and knife them to death throughout the entire game, but in the process of eliminating that, they also made the most boring weapon in Leon's kit into the most interesting one, and made the overall combat much deeper and more dynamic as a result of that. And when your knife eventually breaks, it can simply be brought back to the merchant for repairs, but it will cost you a few thousand pesetas for him to fix it. So once again, you don't want to be going around using this everywhere without any thought, as that can get really expensive in the long term and start to seriously take away from your upgrades. And speaking of upgrades, you can actually upgrade both the damage and the durability of your knife. So if you invest a little extra into it, it can go a pretty long way in the long term. Small consumable knives like kitchen knives can also be found throughout the environments, with these having much lower damage and hardly any durability, but serving as a decent substitute for your main combat knife since they're free to use. Once they're broken though, they're gone for good. So Even with these, you don't want to be spamming them without any thought behind it. Something entirely new here in the RE4 Remake is the addition of some proper stealth mechanics in a Resident Evil game, which we've only ever seen from Revelations 2, so it might sound a bit weird to include it here at first, but they're worked into the game very well. There is never a point in this game where stealth will be required, but anytime that you enter a new area and enemies within it aren't already aware of your presence, you can opt for a more stealthy approach to safely deal with some enemies and take them out while conserving more of your resources and saving them for later. Enemies can be silently taken out with some stealth takedowns using your knife, but yet again, this will cost you some of your remaining durability. So it's not like you aren't using any resources, you're just using less than you would in a straight up fight. It's a surprisingly welcome addition to the game, and even if you don't like the idea of it, it's completely optional, so you can absolutely just choose to never make use of it. And for people like me who get maybe a little too obsessive with saving on resources, it's a wonderful new option. Something else that helps quite a bit with the more limited resources in this game is the addition of a new crafting system, much like the one that was seen in Resident Evil Village. This allows players to find resources and gunpowder throughout the environment, and then use those to create things like certain ammo types that you might be running low on, or even things like flash grenades and frag grenades. This allows players to have a bit more control and freedom to use the weapons that they want for certain encounters, while still keeping supplies limited. And the crafting components also take up space in Leon's attaché case, so if you choose to engage with this system, it's better to craft ammo as early as you can, rather than hoard the supplies and wait for the perfect moment, as doing so will see your inventory getting clogged up pretty quickly. I was worried before this game came out that a crafting system would make ammo management way too easy in the remake, but thankfully, it's balanced out really well, so I would say it's another solid addition. And with that, we have finally covered all of the new mechanics that were added to the RE4 Remake. I know it was a lot, but now we can just talk about more general stuff. And I think a great place to start with that would, of course, be one of the most controversial parts of the original game, Ashley Graham. Now, as much as I enjoy the stories of the Resident Evil games, I'm not really focused on her characterization or her personality here, though those are great in the remake, and I do find her to be much more likable than she was in the original. I'm talking about the gameplay side of Ashley though. More specifically, the process and mechanics of escorting her throughout the game. And thankfully, Ashley's mechanics feel so much better here. Now, I was never someone who found escorting Ashley to be annoying in the original, but that doesn't mean that I don't appreciate just how much smoother and more natural the process is here in the remake. She's shockingly good at avoiding damage during fights, even if you have her set to follow closely behind Leon and you're moving around and weaving between enemies a lot. That's not to say that she'll never take damage, because she certainly will, but she's much better at avoiding it and prioritizing her own safety over strictly sticking to Leon's back. That doesn't exactly mean that she can keep up with all of Leon's moves though.
Ashley!
She can of course still be grabbed mid-fight and carried away, but that's honestly about all that will happen to her the majority of the time now, meaning that the combat doesn't really change much when she's around, which I feel somewhat removes the interesting dynamic that she introduced in the first place. Like sure, on the one hand, it's really nice to not have to babysit her as much, but on the other, it's kind of lame that combat feels largely the same whether she's there or not. This will definitely come down to preference though, as I know that many people hated needing to manage her so much in the original, but I always found it to be an interesting change of pace, especially given the fact that she's only ever around for a chapter or two at a time before they give you a break from her. Easily the most interesting change that's been made to Ashley here though, is that they've actually removed her health bar, which means that you no longer have to use your own healing items on her to keep her alive. Instead, if Ashley takes any damage, she'll simply go into a downed state where enemies can pick her up and carry her away, or if she takes damage again while already down, she'll simply die. This means that in the event that she does actually go down, you have to figure out how you're going to manage getting her back up in a split second, as hesitation or poor planning will almost always get her killed. So in this sense, at least some of the original dynamic has been preserved, even though you don't see it come into play very often. Overall though, I think that Ashley has been improved from the original quite a bit, and I know that a lot of players who hated her in the OG will definitely appreciate the changes that have been made here. Now, in terms of the progression, like I mentioned earlier, it's still fantastic in the RE4 Remake, and might actually be some of the best in-game progression that we've ever seen from the series. Enemies still have a strong tendency to drop pesetas when killed, and those pesetas can then be used as the primary currency for buying things from the game's merchant, who offers anything from simple ammo or healing items, to new weapons, to even upgrades for the weapons that you already have. On top of this, the treasure items from the original also return, with these rewarding players who thoroughly explore and even backtrack through the environments by granting them items that can be sold to the merchant for a large chunk of change. The real interesting part with the treasure items, though, is that the gem inlaying system from the original has also returned, except it's been very much expanded here. In the OG, you would find some treasure items that could be sold immediately, but if you waited, you could also find these little gemstones that could be slotted into said item to significantly increase the value of both the base item and the gems. These gems would always be intended for one specific item though, so the maximum value that these items could achieve was very straightforward, and if you already sold the item before you found the gem, you were just out of luck. Here in the remake though, there are 6 different gems that can be found all throughout the game, with multiple of each gem being hidden throughout the environments. So you can go around and collect these, and then when you actually get a treasure item with gem slots, you can slot in any of these gems that you want, with different gems having different amounts of value that they will add to the item, and there also being a wide variety of different multipliers that you can get for different gem combinations. So for example, if you put 2 of the same color gem into an item, you'll get a small multiplier for that. If you put 3 of the same color gem in an item, you'll get a larger multiplier for that. And if you put 5 different colored gems all into one item, you get a huge multiplier for it that doubles the value of both the items and the gems collectively. It pretty much adds an entirely new minigame into the remake and makes maximizing the value of the items that you find a lot more involved and interesting. And I don't know about you guys, but I personally think that it's pretty damn fun to mess around with different combinations to see just how much value I can get out of that treasure. Additionally, fans of the original might remember that little side quest that they had at the start of the game, where you could find all of those hidden blue medallions throughout the village, and the merchant would give you a whole new free handgun as a reward for your effort. This was an awesome little addition to the early progression of the game, but it was the only side quest of that nature in the entirety of RE4, which, as I mentioned in my review of that game way back, always made me wish that they had more of these throughout the game with their own unique rewards. And thankfully, here in the remake, they've added just that. There are a bunch of these side quests throughout the game, with roughly 1 for every single chapter. You have the return of the classic blue medallion quests, but you can also find other things like selling a certain number of a specific item to the merchant, or even unique mini boss fights that can be found by backtracking through places you've already been. These have also been worked into the core progression near perfectly, as instead of just granting a unique reward outright, they now grant you spinels, a new type of currency that's been added to the remake. These spinels can then be used to purchase special items from the merchant that can't be bought with the usual pesetas, so engaging with the side quests allows you to access an entire new part of the progression system and unlock things like Leon's Matilda from RE2 or the laser sight attachment that I mentioned earlier, where you otherwise wouldn't be able to. It's an awesome expansion on the one thing in RE4 that I always felt had the most missed potential, and keeps the player actively engaged with little side activities as they move through the entire game. So I absolutely adore this change. And in a similar vein, the shooting range minigame from the original also returns, and get this, is also better than ever. The game, at a base level, has been made much more interesting than it was before, with more interesting courses, and these small skull targets that will pop up on occasion that demand extra precision from the player, but will grant extra points for that shot if you manage to hit them, adding more depth to the minigame and encouraging players to really focus and work harder for those higher scores. At the end of each course, you'll be granted an overall rank, and depending on how well you do, you'll be granted some of these new silver and gold coins. These coins can then be brought over to this little gashapon machine near the entrance to get charms for your case, with these charms offering small unique perks that will aid you in your playthrough when equipped. You can only ever equip 3 charms at a time, and while they might seem really simple and boring at first if you only get the lower rarity ones, you can get some pretty awesome effects if you keep engaging with the shooting range that really do make a noticeable difference in your gameplay. So once again, it's a little side activity from the original that has not only been made more engaging, but has also been worked into the core progression of the game really well. Plus, the music that you're listening to in the background right now is the theme for the shooting range, and it is an absolute banger. So, of course, I'm a pretty big fan. And if you couldn't tell already, I really love the Resident Evil 4 Remake. It takes everything that made the original so enjoyable and modernizes it not just with the visuals, but also with a much darker and more believable tone in the story, and a ton of mechanical changes that manage to bring Resident Evil 4 to the modern fanbase in a way that doesn't detract from what made it so fun in the first place. To be totally clear though, I don't think that the Resident Evil 4 Remake is necessarily better than the original, but I don't think it's worse either. I genuinely feel like this is the one remake in the franchise currently that is just as good as its original counterpart, and simply offers a different take on the formula while maintaining pretty much the exact same level of quality. I know there are plenty of people who feel strongly one way or the other, but in my opinion, these are just 2 amazing versions of the same game, and which one you enjoy more will largely come down to preference rather than any sort of objectivity. And personally, I prefer the remake just ever so slightly due to the deeper combat mechanics, better overall pacing, and even more addictive progression. It just so happens to take the 3 things that already made me love RE4 and makes me love them just a little bit more, which is all you could ever really ask from a remake. And yes, as many of you already predicted in previous videos of the retrospective, this is in fact the 3rd of my 3 favorite Resi games. What can I say? I just love the approach that Capcom takes with reimagining their classic titles, and with the exception of RE3, have always fallen in love with every single one of their remakes, despite being an unapologetic fanboy of each of their original counterparts. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give the Resident Evil 4 Remake a 9.3 out of 10. That's going to wrap up this video, but do be sure to check out my other Resident Evil videos if you haven't already, or if you're looking to branch out a bit, maybe check out the series we did a while back where I played every Armored Core game for the first time. Before you leave, definitely make sure to check out the pinned comment down below, as we're getting very close to the end of this retrospective, and there's something down there that you guys will not want to miss. Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to each and every one of our channel members and patrons who make series like this one possible. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like, and especially leave a comment to help me out with the algorithm. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.